Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue our reading of The American Slave Coast by Ned and Constance Subletti. We're going to finish the chapter on the French Revolution in America. Genet thought that Jefferson was an abolitionist, not knowing that he was the biggest progenitor of the expansion of the slave trade in the Americas. The day after Genet arrived in Charleston and the April 9th, 1793 issue of the Apollo, or also known as the Chestertown Spy of Maryland, was headlined by a shocking, just arrived news of the execution of Louis XVI 11 weeks earlier. A smaller, more locally oriented article was also significant. It read, "On Tuesday last, the cornerstone of the African Church was laid on Fifth Street between Walnut and Spruce Streets, Philadelphia, by four members of the church. One of them afterwards kneeled down upon the stone and prayed in a fervent manner for the success and usefulness of the undertaking. The church will be 46 feet in front and 68 feet in depth. The Bill of Rights guarantee of freedom of religion gave protection to the movement of the free Black people toward becoming churched. The Free African Society, founded in Philadelphia in April of 1787, was a mutual aid organization that aimed to create a non-denominational Black church. That's all they wanted to do, was to create a non-denominational Black church. With the disestablishment of the Anglican Church or any other guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, the murderous religious divisions that had long plagued Europe and carried over to the colonies between Catholic and Protestant, between Anglican and Evangelical, were moderated. Instead, there was a division between Black and white that extended into the spiritual sphere. The church, whose construction was announced by the spy, was the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas, founded by the Free African Society's Absalom Jones. After a split along the Anglican Methodist lines, the Society's Richard Allen founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Both churches taught reading to children. Mother Bethel, the AME Church, which began as the blacksmith shop meeting house, was consecrated on July 29, 1794, as a great wave of evangelization was sweeping over First Amendment America, with numbers of African Americans taking to Jesus as their liberator. There's an argument here that Jesus meant just us because of how they phonetically would have pronounced it. Methodism was still associated with anti-slavery, and abolition societies already existed in the 1790s, as per the notice in the Charleston Spy, which has been enlarged and reproduced in the text. It reads, "Members of the Abolition Society are requested to meet at the Methodist Meeting House in Chestertown on Friday, the 3rd day of May next, precisely at 11 o'clock a.m., by order of the President, Abraham Wrigley, Secretary, Chestertown, April 23rd, 1793. There was no such societies in the Low Country where such a thing could not have been tolerated, nor were the enslaved there much allowed to preach, as Frederick Law Olmsted quoted a slave owner in 1853 saying, 'Unless a white man hears what they have to say.' Greetings, Anthony McPhail. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. The Charlestonians were known for extending generous, courteous welcomes to foreigners of a certain social rank, with which they had hoped to win over ambassadors for the goodness of slavery. Gannett from France was a superstar welcome in South Carolina, where he met leading men of the state, Dictator Rutledge, Senator Ralph Izard, Thomas Pinckney. While not many of the Federalists in Charleston turned out to greet him, most of the Southern elite supported the Republicans in France. They comported flatteringly with the Charlestonians' view of their own importance that the emissary of the great nation in the world, of the greatest nation in the world, had come to see them first. With South Carolina Governor William Moultrie's full permission, Gannett commissioned 4 privateers, one of them named the Citizen Gannett, which began attacking English shipping and bringing the prizes to the Charleston harbor. That activity, which Jefferson ultimately made him stop, carried the possibility of bringing down retribution or even a declaration of war against the United States by the British Navy, which at the time was the world's most powerful navy. It provided the direct motivation for the passage of the next Congress and of the Neutrality Act of 1794, which prohibited freelance warmongering. Gannett wrote that Izard told him, though he disregarded the advice, that Jefferson and Madison pretend to be Republicans. They will do everything in their power to secure you on their side and will be friendly to you as long as your country or yourself may be serviceable to their ambitious views. Place no confidence in them. When Gannett answered that, I shall have no other friends in America but those who will be friendly to France and to the cause of liberty, Izard replied, according to Gannett, oh, then I see what you are doing, to fall into the snares of Mr. Jefferson and his party, and very probably will become their victim. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. We're on page 318 of The American Slave Coast. We're reading about the implications of the French Revolution and how when they came to visit Jefferson, they were really trying to play both sides against the middle to get into a more powerful position. Jefferson indeed befriended Gannett. The Virginia trio of Jefferson, Madison, and James Monroe saw American support for Republican France as essential. In a letter to James Monroe, dated June 4th of 1793, Jefferson, looking forward to his dual citizenship for all, wrote, France has explained herself generously. She wishes to promote our prosperity by giving us in all her possessions all the rights of her native citizens and to receive our vessels as her vessels. This is the language of her new minister. Great Britain holds back with the most sullen silence and reserve. Washington took Jefferson's advice to receive Gannett, but did it standing in front of portraits of the murdered St. Louis, who has supported him in the War of Independence, and Marie Antoinette, who had not yet gone to the guillotine. By recognizing Gannett, the pro-British Washington was not merely recognizing the French Revolution, but was actively harboring a hostile agent against Britain. Gannett proposed a commercial treaty, a family compact he called it, that Jefferson was in favor of, but George Washington shot down, which would have ultimately had the effect of making the United States France's ally against Great Britain in war. So I want you to remember that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were ideologically very different when it came to how to handle the administration of the country. And Thomas Jefferson was George Washington's enemy from within. The radical Montagnard faction of the Jacobin Club came to power in France on June 2nd, 1793. The execution of Louis XVI was the beginning of the ascent of power of the terrorists, Danton, Marat, Robespierre, as the Montagnards began liquidating all opposition. That means they were killing everybody, with the Girondins as their main political targets. Genet, who also, like all transatlantic diplomats, had to contend with a lag of 5 weeks minimum and often months to receive word from home, continued prosecuting his agenda. Meanwhile, Brissot and 21 other Girondins went to the guillotine on October 31st, 1793. One of the charges against Brissot, was his responsibility for Genet's mission. According to Genet's account, the popularity of the French Revolution in the United States brought a group of Philadelphians to ask him for advice on what to name their Jacobin Club, the constitution of which had been drawn up by Pennsylvania Secretary of State Alexander Dallas. Genet diplomatically suggested that they call it the Democratic Club. Soon, every American city had a club with a variety of names and collectively remembered as the Democratic Republican Societies, which were in favor of the French Revolution and which began the formalization of the two opposition parties of Democrat and Republican, with Jefferson as its leader. In Saint-Domingue, the Jacobin Revolution civilian commissioners Liger, Félicité Sontrax, and Etienne Polverel came into open confrontation with General Francois Thomas Galbaud Fort, the royalist head of the French fleet and an absentee landowner in Saint-Domingue, who had assumed authority. It's significant to say that he was an absentee landowner. That means his plantation ran itself. He had people in place on the plantation that were doing the work. He may or may not have been in favor of slavery and their enslavement, but he was an absentee landowner in Saint-Domingue. After Galbaud's attack on Cap Francis, which sent 2,000 or so sailors and newly unchained political prisoners to run riot in that city on June 20th, 1793, they were driven away by an army of Black freedmen fighting on the side of Sontrax and Polverel. In a battle that lasted several days, the city of Cap Francois, Saint-Domingue's largest port and the center of arts and culture, burned to the ground. Galbaud evacuated with about 10,000 people, whom he brought to Baltimore first. By August, his fleet had dropped anchor in New York, from which base his ships began cruising up and down the coast. Genet tried to have Galbaud arrested, but he had broken no U.S. law. Refugees had fled Saint-Domingue with the first insurrection in 1791. Now, in a new wave, more refugees traveled down the Antilles to Guadeloupe, Puerto Rico, and Trinidad, or to next door, British controlled Jamaica, while the largest number sailed up the Gulf Stream to the east coast of the United States. Greetings, KW Don 7. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. We're reading The American Slave Coast. We're on page 320. They're talking about the French Revolution and its implications here in America. Only a few went to New Orleans at that time, though later the U.S. controlled New Orleans would become a magnet for what Nathalie Dessens describes as the ultimate convergence zone of Real Saint Domingue diaspora that kept in touch with family, friends, and business connections, both by correspondence and by travel. But New Orleans was not an immediate destination in 1793. It was not accessible by sail as Atlantic North America was because the loop of the current of the Gulf. Moreover, moreover, the Spanish government of Louisiana was not welcoming to French refugees, some of whom were evangelists for the revolution. Anthony McPhail says 10,000 came later. 10,000 of them came to New Orleans later. And those that came to New Orleans later were the real excuse me, were the real captors and the real slaveholders and the real people that had class issues. The convoy of 137 ships carrying Dominican refugees arrived at Norfolk, Virginia in July of 1793. From there, they went to cities up and down the coastline. Many went to Charleston, where there was already a community of French-speaking Huguenots. Bringing a new wave of Catholicism to the city, they effectively took over an Irish church there. John E. Bauer notes that Saint Domingue's Creoles, many of them Republican, tended to go to the southern states, while French-born royalists generally settled in New England and the mid-Atlantic states. About 4,000 Dominicans went to New York. In Philadelphia, the nation's capital at the time and largest city, refugees began arriving from Saint Domingue in the spring, were widely believed to have brought the city's first yellow fever epidemic in 1793, which killed over 10% of the town's population, causing many residents to flee, while the Free African Society cared for the sick and dying. Now remember, they thought that the free Africans were immune, and they thought that this would show the white people their humanity. They also taught them about vaccinations and how to vaccinate each other against the disease. Erupting out of the dockside area, it paralyzed the city and the U.S. government. Benjamin Rush identified the disease on August 19th, and it abated in mid-October when the weather cooled and mosquitoes stopped biting. Though their agency as disease vectors was not yet realized, and it did not spread anywhere else. During this crisis, and in the months before, French privateers had been openly using the United States as a base. Privateers is a polite word for pirates. Their vessels fitted out in the United States had been taking British prizes and Spanish and even American and bringing them into American harbors, Charleston, New York, Wilmington, and Boston. This was inviting war with Britain, but as Jefferson insisted in a cabinet meeting, the French have by treaty a right to come into our ports with prizes. Finally, realizing that Genet's attacks on British shipping from a U.S. base could put them at war with England, Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson concurred that he had to stop passing out letters of marque to privateers, pirates. In the summer of 1793, it stands out for the electric political turmoil in Philadelphia. The mounting death toll from the epidemic, combined with the convulsive energy emanating from the terror in Paris and from Saint Domingue, kept the town agitated. As political clubs increased in number and in aggression, Washington's government was nearly overthrown as Adams angrily reminded Jefferson in an exchange of letters 20 years later, saying, "You certainly never felt the terrorism excited by Genet in 1793 when 10,000 people in the streets of Philadelphia, day after day, threatened to drag Washington out of his house and effect a revolution in government or compel it to declare war in favor of the French Revolution and against England. The coolest and firmest minds, even among the Quakers in Philadelphia, had given their opinions to me that nothing but the yellow fever could have saved the United States from a total revolution of government. I have no doubt you, with a capital Y, was fast asleep in philosophical tranquility when 10,000 people, and perhaps many more, were parading the streets of Philadelphia. What think you of terrorism, Mr. Jefferson?" Jefferson rationalized the mass guillotinings in Paris, even though some of his friends had fallen victim. But when the Jacobins brought terror to Jefferson in the form of, but then the Jacobins brought terror to Jefferson in the form of an Emancipation Proclamation. The Black Army was the strongest force in Saint Domingue, and it was better to be with it than against it. The French Navy was an enemy, and Britain and Spain were both trying to take the colony over. Needing allies, Sonthrax and Paul Varel offered freedom to slaves who would join them, at first within a limited geographic range, then widening its scope. Justified by strategic considerations and consistent with their own revolutionary principles, they unilaterally abolished slavery by proclamation in the northern province of Saint Domingue on August 29, 1793. Over the next 2 months, the decree was at least theoretically extended to the rest of the island, though the commissioners did not control all the territory. They needed a unified force as possible. In September, the British invaded Saint Domingue from their base in Jamaica, attracting the support of pro-British planters. Though Jefferson was alarmed by Genet's reckless actions, he was the administration member identified with the French. He had tried to resign before now, in the wake of the turbulence that trailed Genet. His opposition to Washington's administration made his position untenable. Jefferson left the post of Secretary of State on December 31st, 1793, announcing his return to Monticello. Vice President John Adams' comment in a letter to his own son, John Quincy Adams, attributed Jefferson's resignation to his not making enough money as vice president to support his habit of expensive living, adding, "Jefferson thinks by his step to get a reputation of an humble, modest, meek man, wholly without ambition or vanity. He may have deceived himself into this belief, but if a prospect opens, the world will see, he will feel that he is as ambitious as Oliver Cromwell, though he's not a soldier. Anthony McPhail says, I have interesting story related to the French privateer Jean Lafitte, who opened up Louisiana. Some of his enslaved African descendants migrated here in North Louisiana. Ramon Lafitte, who I know is a descendant of them. That is incredible. That is incredible. And those privateers were pirates. So it'd be interesting to hear that story. When we're done, if you don't mind coming up and telling us the story, we would all be appreciative. It was time to make some money. As Jefferson prepared to leave public life, he wrote the iron merchant Caleb Loans, asking for 60 to 90 days credit in order on an order for iron rod to be made into nails. I suppose 1 ton will serve me the first quarter of the year, by the end of which I shall be ready to work up to 2 or 3 times as much every quarter. He was going to go into business for himself, installing a cottage industry nail factory with a workforce that Jefferson described as a dozen little boys from 10 to 16 years of age. What we know is that those were probably slaves. They were given extra rations of meat and fish and a suit of blue or red for the best workers. Needless to say, they were kept away from reading and writing and spent their formative years in captivity, living together and making nails together all day until they were 16, when they were transferred to field labor. From 1794 to 1797, while Jefferson was at Monticello and supervising it daily, his slave labor nail factory was a profitable operation, because in any business, labor is usually your largest cost. And these people got rich by extracting labor from Black people. Sonthax and Paul Varel's Declaration of Emancipation was ratified and extended to all those enslaved in French territories on February 4th, 1794, by the National Convention in Paris. It was the most radical achievement of the French Revolution, the immediate emancipation of slaves, with no period of transition. When the ratification was confirmed, the general Toussaint Louverture stopped fighting under the Spanish flag in Saint Domingue and came over to fight under the French. The slaves of Saint Domingue had risen up and killed not only their masters, but slavery itself. Speaking of a hypothetical war that might pit the United States allied with France against Britain, Ralph Izard, who had lived in both London and in Paris, and who had welcomed Citizen Genet to Charleston with open arms, wrote, by decree of the Convention of France, all of the slaves in their colonies are emancipated. A joint war with France under the present circumstances would occasion a prodigious number of the lower order of Frenchmen to come into this country, who would fraternize with our democratical clubs and introduce the same horrid tragedies among our Negroes, which have been so fatally exhibited in the French islands. So he was worried about revolution. Are the inhabitants of South Carolina ignorant of these things? Or is it the will of God that the proprietors of Negroes should themselves be the instruments of destroying that species of property? So, are you interested in totally eradicating your economy? Because if you let these Frenchmen in, they're going to do to South Carolina what they did to Saint Domingue. From Georgia up to Virginia, slave owning whites entered a new era of panic that at times crossed over into mass hysteria over the prospect of Black revolutionary infiltration from the island. Our town swarms with strange Negroes, wrote the Norfolk County Commandant Colonel Willis Wilson from Portsmouth, Virginia, to Governor Henry Lee in August of 1793. In a panic, Wilson demanded that Lee send troops to defend against the many hundreds of French Negroes in the Portsmouth streets, because the biggest threat to white supremacy and slavery at that time and to this day is a truly free Black person. A truly free Black person will show a slave that they are a slave, and the slave will rise up. But for as long as everyone is asleep or enslaved, they will unfortunately remain as such. The looming protests of Sonntag's fear in the slave owners' collective imagination of infiltration by Black warriors argued rising prices for supplies of domestically born people. No one wanted foreign slave trade now, not even South Carolina. By this time, Jefferson was positively bullish on the profits to be made from the reproduction of the enslaved. In April 1794, he wrote to Madame Plumard de Ballinger, a friend from Paris whose relative, J.P.P. Deroux, was living in Charlottesville and doing poorly. Blaming Deroux's bankruptcy on the Haitian Revolution, Jefferson politely asked Madame Plumard to send her relative money. He promised to see to it that her money would be put to the most conservative investment possible, the capitalized womb. I think I may pledge myself that it shall be every farthing of it laid out in lands and Negroes, which besides a present support, being a silent profit from 5 to 10% in this country by the increase in their value. So what he was saying is that if you bought a female or if you bought an enslaved person, enslaved female, then you would see an increase in your investment of 5 to 10% annually based on how many births they had. Exiled Dominican planters, many of whom clung on to the belief that they would return to claim their rightful, real, and human property, told terrifying tales that became further elaborated in the telling, further radicalizing United States slave owners. But the exodus from Saint Domingue to North America did not only bring paranoia. The Dominicans were the world's leaders in plantation technology. They brought skills, techniques, and knowledge everywhere they went, to say nothing of arts and culture. In eastern Cuba and Puerto Rico, they introduced the cultivation of coffee, subsequently a mainstay for those mountainous territories, along with creolized music and other cultural paradigms that still resonate in those islands to this very day. In South Carolina, they showed the few farmers who were still growing indigo new chemical reagents they could use in the process. In Baltimore, which conducted much maritime trade with Saint Domingue under Toussaint's leadership, the Dominicans' influence was profound. Their boatwrights, both enslaved and free, knew French boat building techniques. Plus, they knew all about building pirate ships. But Baltimore was heavily invested in the pirate ship business. We read French as meaning Dominican in the advertisement in the June 17th, 1795 issue of the Maryland Journal and Baltimore Universal Daily Advertiser that offered a new vessel for sale, built at Baltimore and launched the latter part of this month. She is built with live oak and cedar, nailed and finished after the French manner, emphasis added, being calculated for extraordinary sailing. The Dominicans brought new ideas of construction and finish to what was becoming a uniquely Baltimorean style of boat. The steeply raked, low draft, fastest thing on the water vessel that would later become known as the Baltimore Clipper. With virtually all of Antillean trade being illegal according to the laws of one or another European country, vessels had to be fast and light. So everything was sacrificed to speed in this new model, which carried less freight than state-sanctioned merchant marines. These vessels were narrow and shallow, so they could go places large ocean-going vessels couldn't. The crew slept on deck. Many were fitted with sweeps or oars so that they could drop their sails and creep unseen when they set sail at night in the dark of the moon. With their strongly raked masts, they could outfly any ship if they were to be windward. They looked dashing. The Baltimore boatwrights prided themselves in the quality of their construction. Though the major influx of Dominicans did not come to Louisiana until 1809, the professions of journalism and law there were begun by Dominicans. They founded newspapers and participated in the writing of the state's Constitution of 1812, which was debated and written in French and then sent to Washington in translation. Stars of Saint Domingue's theater scene took refuge in New Orleans, where their language was understood. Their first great U.S. piano virtuoso, and arguably the greatest 19th century U.S. composer, was Dominican descended New Orleanian Louis Moreau Gottschalk. Naturalist and artist John James Audubon was Dominican born. One celebrated refugee of the Haitian Revolution went to Spanish controlled Florida. The Black Dominican born George Bissau was an early leader of the slave uprising. He had received a blessing from Bookman himself and was subsequently Toussaint Louverture's superior officer in the Spanish army. Toussaint went over to the French army after the National Convention ratified Sonntag's Emancipation Proclamation, but Bissau remained with the Spanish. The two wound up fighting each other before Bissau ultimately evacuated. Bissau was a fully commissioned general of the Spanish army in good standing when he arrived in Florida in early 1796 with an entourage of 23, including 5 family members and 1 slave. The Black general strolled through the streets of St. Augustine in fine clothes trimmed in gold, writes Jane Landers, wearing the gold medal of the Spanish King Charles IV, a silver trimmed saber, and a fancy ivory and silver dagger. As slave owning planters in Florida, many of them English speakers who had come in from the north, watched in horror. Bissau and his men received land grants and began clearing ground for plantations. They spoke more of their black countrymen being on the way, though Spain wasn't about to let that happen. A black man who had killed slave owners was living in comfort with full military authority in Florida. Nothing could have been more calculated to disturb the Georgians and the Carolinians, who, for their part, were experiencing an agricultural revolution that would create a vast new market for slaves. And we're going to stop reading right there because next week we're going to get into part 4, which is the Star Spangled Slave Trade. And we're going to read the Cotton Club. But I would like Anthony McPhail, if at all possible, to come up and tell us his story of these privateer descendants that he knows so that we can hear how these people are doing and what they are up to now. Now, remember, Thomas Jefferson was no friend of the African American. Neither was George Washington, but George Washington was the British loyalist. He still believed in the monarchy. He believed in these different British standards of living. He believed in being on the side of the British. He just didn't like their taxes. He didn't like the fact that they were taxing people unduly without representation and that they weren't protecting the people from the Native Americans. So just remember that none of these people that they name as founders and framers, as great men of old, as the leading legends of this country, none of them had any positive intent for the African. None of them. They all made their wealth and continued their legacies on the backs of the free labor that they were able to extract from African people. All right, so you guys, perhaps we'll get to hear the story of Raymond Lafitte and French privateer Jean Lafitte today or a different day. It depends on Anthony McPhail, but it looks like he may not be there anymore. I appreciate each and every one of you for being here. I value your input. I want to thank Anthony McPhail, KW Don 7, and the Forecast Radio for being here in the chat with me. I know that Manning for Mayor is listening. I know that Sister Raw and the elders are listening. I know that Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, which broadcasts on Saturdays, is listening. I know that Brother Bakari, who broadcasts from the Black Business Network periodically, is listening. I know that Oni Tase from the Pro Black Perspective is listening, and so many others, including Bawana Haguziki, Dorico Cooper, and Mike Cool, who is a new subscriber. I value each and every one of you, and I thank you. Oh, give me one moment. Anthony McPhail is here. Can you hear me, Anthony? It says, one moment. Okay. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. How you doing, Matron? How are you?
Give me one moment.
I'm here.
I see you. All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. I can hear you.
All right. I'm having technical difficulties. So I'm going to let you tell your story. Give me one moment while I leave the stage and come back.
Okay. We'll be back in a few minutes, man. We having technical difficulties right now. The matron will be right back. So everybody that's hang loose for a minute, man, and I give a quick story about what I learned about some of the Africans who are the descendants of some of Jean Lafitte's enslaved Africans. So everybody just hang on, man, till the matron get back on. She'll be back momentarily, everybody. Just hang on till she make it back. The American Slave Coast been some great reading by the matron, man. I've really been enjoying. I know y'all all have, because the matron always brings the heat and always does a great job. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Anthony McPhail, can you hear me? I can hear you now. All right, great. Thank you so much for those accolades. I can hear you now.
Okay. Great reading, matron. We always love your reading. But yeah, what I found out, I had a friend of mine, a guy, who actually, I think we went to school together. We was in high school at the same time. We was from the same neighborhood, but we didn't go to the same high school, but I knew him. This brother's name right now, he's like a moving shaker on the scene here in Shreveport. His name is Ramon Lafitte. But anyway, like I used to work with his uncle, and like I used to talk with his uncle, and I was saying, Lafitte, man, that's an interesting name, man. It sounds like from South Louisiana. He said, well, yeah, my people are from South Louisiana. And so we just got to talking, and he said that actually, he's a descendant of Africans who were, first of all, Jean Lafitte, the pirate, and let's call him what he was. He was a pirate. They call a nice name like privateer. He was a pirate. He was a low down, dirty pirate, who trafficked in African people, and he was merciless in it too. But yeah, he had, like, when he had got in trouble with the U.S. government, because he went back and forth with the Americans, with Thomas Jefferson and all of their gang, because sometimes he would be on different sides. He would do things for the French sometimes. For the French, and then for the Americans, and then he would work out deals with local Spanish rulers in Cuba. But like the whole Gulf of Mexico was his area. Like when he got in some trouble with the Americans, he got jailed. He lost his Africans. They got all of his Africans, and they probably was, Africans from the continent. But anyway, what the story was, from what I was told that it was several hundred Africans, I guess. And the Africans having their African names, and how white folks like to give us other names and the European surnames. But what happened? He gave all of his Africans his last name, and they called them all Lafitte's. You know what I'm saying? Whatever first name they had, they called them all Lafitte's. But anyway, like on up until from the time, I think he died somewhere in the 1820s or something like that. He was a young guy. He wasn't even 50 years old. But some of those Africans had moved after the wars, had moved up into North Louis, moved like around into Natchitoches, which is a town about like 50 miles from me, which had was an old French settlement. But eventually, some of them moved up to Shreveport, where I live at. Bringing their name and bringing their history, as being, descendants of some of us Jean Lafitte's enslaved Africans. And it's a story that they talk about it a lot. They relish it, man, being, from that lineage. Our ancestors was at once was the enslaved Africans of Jean Lafitte the pirate. But yeah, which I don't get it, but yeah, they all tell the story about it, man. How they were the descendants of those Africans who had been enslaved by Jean Lafitte. And they was from a town down off the coast of Louisiana called Barataria, which is still a place now. Barataria Bay, where Jean Lafitte used to operate from. But like I said, when he got caught by the U.S. government and arrested, he lost his Africans, and some of them would give him freedom, and some of them weren't because they had helped participate in the War of 1814, the Battle of New Orleans, and so some of them were granted freedom, and those who granted freedom had, I guess, they moved around and eventually had made it up here. After because the Americans had took over, from the French, in colonial Louisiana at that time, and like a lot of them moved around, But yeah, the Lafitte's up here, they always tell the story about them, about their heritage going back to South Louisiana and being formerly, their ancestors being enslaved by Jean Lafitte. So yeah, that was the little story I wanted to tell. Yes, ma'am.
Wow, that's incredible. It's amazing how the things we will find pride in,
Yeah,
because I'm
exactly.
sure they tell their story with pride, not
About being a slave.
about being a slave, about having lost their identity and being basically taken over by this white man.
Yeah, yeah. Like it's a badge of honor that Lafitte was our master,
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Our
but that
people
was the
need
story,
help.
Major. Yeah.
It's a hell of a story. Our people need help.
Well, yeah, it's that menacide and something else.
Yes, it
But hey,
is.
great reading, Matron, man. I'm gonna knock off and go and chill out and everything. But great reading, really enjoy the stories.
Thank you. I enjoy you being here. You always have so much to add to the conversation. So I
All
thank you
right.
for being here. All right.
All right, take it easy now.
You take it easy too. All right. I will be back next Tuesday reading the next part of, excuse me, the American Slave Coast. We're getting into some of the things that were done in the Americas, such as the Star Spangled Slave Trade and how the state continued to sanction slavery. We'll be getting into how George Washington was complicit, how the laws were, well, while they did not mention the enslaved people specifically, were specifically crafted to continue our enslavement. And so when we talk about these things, we know that they are talking about us, but they're talking around us, ignoring the subject of us. We built this country under duress. We built this country under the whip and under the lash, but we built it. Okay. And we have to take pride in what we've done and who we are. And once we realize who we are, we can stand up and their game ends, because without us, there is no them. They do not have this great nation. They stole everything that they have. There is no such thing as white supremacy. It is a figment of their imagination and a lie that we perpetuate. Just remember that they are not superior. They only want you to believe that they're superior. They know where their technology comes from. Black people. They know where their mathematics comes from. Africa and India. They know where their writing and language comes from. They know these things. And they are afraid that you will get to figure out where you came from and where these different things came from. And once you realize where these different things come from, and once you accept that as reality, you can then stand up a full human being and accept your full humanity and do what needs to be done. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. Thank you, Anthony McPhail, for coming up to discuss and expound upon us on these mentally challenged Negroes that take pride in being descendants of enslaved people that were enslaved by Lafitte, and they carry that name forward. They need to kill that name. That would be their best option. But thank you for sharing that story. Thank you for being here. I will talk to each and every one of you next Monday with this reading, but I'll be back on Thursday at 9 p.m. with Brainwashed. All right. I will talk to you soon. Peace, guys.